It all began on a Monday morning in Chicago, a morning that felt as ordinary as any other, but would end up tearing the ground out from under my feet. A day that started with the clatter of pans in the kitchen, the strong aroma of fresh coffee mixing with the faint trace of a perfume sample I had left on the dining table the night before. Because as the head of a boutique fragrance company I had built from scratch after my husband's death, testing scents was as natural to me as breathing. And I was rushing through my routine, hurrying to get ready to oversee a new production line I had been working on for years, the pride of my career and the legacy I wanted to leave behind, while my only son, Daniel, already dressed in a sharp navy suit, adjusted his tie in front of the hallway mirror, preparing for a high-stakes meeting at the investment firm where he served as managing director. And seeing him like that filled me with a deep pride that never dulled over time, because Daniel was everything to me, the child I had poured all my love and sacrifice into after losing my husband a decade ago. And in the kitchen, my daughter-in-law Melissa stood with her long blonde hair tied neatly back, moving quickly between stove and counter, her phone tucked between shoulder and ear as she laughed with friends while packing two lunch containers, one large for Daniel and one small for me, a gesture she had made habit over the years. And I stood in the doorway watching her multitask with warmth in my chest, thinking how thoughtful she was to make sure neither her husband nor her mother-in-law went without a home-cooked meal in a city where street food could be rushed, greasy, and unsafe. And when she caught my gaze, she smiled brightly and said she just wanted everyone to eat well, that she worried about us both. Words that melted me because I had always tried to see Melissa not just as a daughter-in-law, but as the daughter I never had, a woman so full of energy and family spirit that she made me believe my son had chosen wisely. So when we were heading out, she handed me the smaller container while slipping the larger one into Daniel's leather briefcase in the backseat of his car, and I tucked mine into my purse without a second thought, feeling grateful to have such a considerate young woman in our lives. But what none of us realized then was that this simple act, that switch of plastic lids and containers, would soon unravel everything we thought we knew about family, loyalty, and love. Because later that day, as lunchtime rolled around and my office buzzed with the chatter of young employees gossiping about their marriages and children, I pulled the container from my purse and frowned when I noticed it was larger than usual. Melissa must have accidentally mixed them up, I thought, with a little laugh, shaking my head at her forgetfulness, imagining how Daniel might be confused to find mine in his bag. But when I opened the lid, my smile faded as I noticed tiny white grains stuck to the edge of the container, glimmering faintly under the fluorescent lights of the break room, almost like sugar crystals on the rim of a margarita glass, which struck me as odd because the food inside was savory, not sweet. And I chuckled nervously, joking aloud to the women gathered near me that my daughter-in-law must be distracted and trying to fatten her hard-working husband with sugar sprinkled on dinner. And they laughed, teasing me with playful remarks, until I carried it over to my closest colleague, a man named Richard, who had been a doctor years ago before retiring into workplace safety consulting for my fragrance company. A man I trusted deeply because over the years he had become not only my professional confidant, but also something like family. And I presented the lunch to him, expecting him to laugh along with the others, but instead, I watched the color drain from his face as he tilted the container under the light, ran his finger along the rim, rubbed the white dust between his fingertips, and looked at me with an intensity that froze my blood, asking sharply who had prepared the food, his voice suddenly grave. And when I told him it was my daughter-in-law, who always cooked for Daniel and me, he shook his head, his eyes dark with alarm, and with a voice that left no room for doubt, he told me I needed to get my son to a hospital immediately, that he could not explain yet, but it was urgent, life or death urgent. And my chest caved in at those words, the laughter in the break room dying instantly as everyone fell silent, eyes darting between Richard and me, confused and frightened. But all I could feel was a crushing panic swelling in my chest as I begged him to tell me what was wrong, to explain, and his hand trembled as he squeezed mine whispering that he would never joke about such a thing, that the white grains were no sugar at all, that they looked like something terrible. And though he did not name it then, his urgency was all the proof I needed. Because in that moment, the walls of my world shifted and tilted as if the very ground had betrayed me, and I clutched that container like it was a bomb. Because maybe that's exactly what it was. A silent weapon meant not for me, but for my son, my Daniel, my everything. And within minutes, I was rushing out of the building, my heart pounding, my thoughts a swirl of disbelief and terror, calling my driver who had been with me for more than 20 years, instructing him to head straight to Northwestern Memorial Hospital, clutching the container sealed now inside a plastic bag, as though it were evidence in a crime I wasn't ready to name, staring blankly out the car window at the bustling Chicago streets, the honking horns, the flashing billboards, the normal life I was now disconnected from, because all I could think of was Daniel's smile, Daniel's childhood, Daniel's weary complaints of stomach aches I had dismissed as stress, his tired eyes I had blamed for long hours, and how blind I had been to the possibility that something far darker had been eating away at him, meal after meal, spoonful after spoonful, each bite a betrayal wrapped in love. And when I reached the hospital and handed over the container, insisting it be analyzed immediately, I felt like a mother begging the world not to take her child away, waiting in that sterile white corridor where every tick of the clock mocked me with its slowness, until a young physician emerged with the lab results, his eyes heavy with pity when he said the word that echoed in my skull like a hammer strike: arsenic. And I thought I would collapse then and there, because that wasn't sugar on the rim of Daniel's lunch. It was poison, deliberate and merciless. A toxin that explained his fatigue, his stomach pains, his frailty. A poison that could have stolen him from me forever, if not for a careless mix-up. And as my vision blurred with tears, only one image burned bright in my mind. Melissa. My daughter-in-law, the woman I had welcomed into my family like a daughter, the woman whose smile seemed warm but now twisted in my memory into something cold and calculating. And though my heart screamed for denial, though part of me wanted to cling to the belief that this was all a terrible misunderstanding, deep down, I already knew the truth. That this wasn't an accident, that someone under my roof, someone I loved and trusted, wanted my son dead. And now it was up to me to stop them before it was too late. The drive back from Northwestern Memorial Hospital felt like floating through a nightmare. The city outside alive with its usual rhythm, sirens wailing in the distance, pedestrians wrapped in coats rushing against the wind, the river glinting with sunlight between skyscrapers. But for me, everything was muted, like watching life through glass, because my mind could only replay that one word again and again: arsenic. And the young doctor's voice explaining in clinical terms how small, consistent doses over time could ravage Daniel's organs, drain his strength, and eventually kill him. And as I clutched the bagged container in my lap, the evidence of betrayal that could have ended my son's life, my thoughts spiraled back to Melissa, the daughter-in-law I had cherished, the woman who had once promised me she would take care of Daniel for as long as she lived, who had sat at my dinner table with laughter in her eyes and gratitude in her words, who I had defended in front of friends whenever anyone hinted she might be too ambitious or too charming for her own good. And now every one of those memories felt like shards of glass in my chest, cutting me with the possibility that her smile, her kindness, had only been a mask. Because if she had been the one sprinkling poison on Daniel's meals, then every gesture of care was a calculated step toward murder. And the realization left me so sick I could barely breathe. Yet my instinct, as a mother, screamed louder than my grief. I had to protect Daniel, even if it meant accepting the most painful truth of my life. So, instead of going home, I ordered my driver to take me to the Loop, to the office of my longtime attorney, Charles Whitman, a seasoned man with silver hair and gold-rimmed glasses who had handled every legal detail of my company and estate for decades. Because if there was one person who could help me untangle the legal threads that might explain Melissa's motive, it was him. And when I sat across from his mahogany desk, my hands trembling as I told him to pull up my will and estate documents, he frowned but complied, opening a thick file that smelled faintly of dust and ink. And as he laid out the clauses, I felt my stomach twist tighter with every line because in black and white, it spelled out what I had once thought was fairness, that if anything happened to Daniel, Melissa would inherit everything. Not just his share, but the entire estate, the properties, the investments, even controlling interest in my fragrance company. Because years ago, in a moment of misguided affection, I had insisted on treating her like my own blood. And Charles explained gently but firmly that unless I changed it while I was alive, that clause would stand, which meant if Daniel died, Melissa would become the sole heir to a fortune that had taken me decades to build. And suddenly it all snapped into place. Every curious question she had asked about the value of our downtown condo, every offhand remark about wanting to take the company in a new direction if she were ever in charge, even her casual comments about Daniel looking tired or stressed. All of it now seemed like threads of a long woven plan, and my skin crawled as I realized the woman I had welcomed into my home may have been waiting patiently, meal after meal, for her opportunity to erase the one person standing between her and unimaginable wealth. And as I left Charles's office, the cold wind off Lake Michigan biting my face, my resolve hardened like steel. Because no matter how much it broke my heart, I would not sit back and let my son become a victim. So, the next morning I walked into Daniel's high-rise office in the financial district without warning, catching him just as he left a meeting. His tie loosened and his eyes lighting up with boyish joy when he saw me, and his voice carried that playful warmth he always used, joking that I must have come to spy on him to make sure he was working hard. But the words lodged in my throat because how could I tell him that the woman he slept beside every night, the woman who kissed his cheek in the morning, was trying to kill him? And yet I had no choice. So I closed the office door behind us, sat across from him in the leather chairs by the window overlooking the river, and slid the lab report and a copy of my will across the table, whispering for him to read. And I watched the light drain from his face as he scanned the papers, his hands trembling so hard the sheets rattled, his lips moving silently as he read the words arsenic contamination. And finally, his eyes shot up to mine, wide with disbelief and horror, his voice cracking as he stammered that Melissa loved him, that she cooked every day because she cared, that this had to be some mistake. And my heart shattered seeing him cling to denial. But I forced myself to speak the truth, recounting everything: the container mix-up, Richard's urgent warning, the doctor's confirmation. And as I spoke, his face crumpled, denial crumbling into anguish, then anger, his fist slamming against the desk as he realized the pattern of his symptoms matched exactly what the doctor had described. And tears filled my eyes as I reached across the desk to grip his hand, telling him I couldn't lose him, not after everything, that he had to believe me even if it tore his heart apart. And slowly, painfully, he nodded, his jaw clenched as if holding back a scream, vowing that if Melissa had truly betrayed him, he would help me expose her because he would not let greed destroy the family we had fought so hard to hold together. And together, we walked that afternoon into the 18th District Police Station on State Street, where we met Detective Harris, a broad-shouldered man with salt and pepper hair and a voice that carried authority. And we told him everything, from the suspicious food to the will to Daniel's declining health. And he listened in silence, his pen scratching across a notepad, his expression unreadable until, finally, he leaned back, steepling his fingers, and said this was serious enough to warrant an undercover investigation, that they would need to install hidden cameras in our kitchen, collect additional food samples, and monitor Melissa's movements. But under no circumstances could she know we suspected her, because if she panicked, she might accelerate whatever plan she had. And though the idea of playing along with a woman I now saw as a predator made my skin crawl, I agreed, because the alternative, doing nothing, meant gambling with Daniel's life. So that evening, I returned home, my pulse racing as I saw Melissa sitting on the porch with her phone in hand, smiling as she looked up and offered to book us both a spa day that weekend, her voice dripping with casual sweetness. And though I forced a polite smile and declined, inside my stomach turned, because now I knew that beneath that bright exterior lurked someone capable of sprinkling death into a bowl of soup without a flicker of remorse. And as I retreated into my room that night, closing the door with trembling hands, I understood that the war had begun. A war I never asked for, but one I was determined to fight, because a mother's love is the most dangerous weapon of all, and I was prepared to wield it to the very end. That night, I could barely sleep, lying in bed staring at the ceiling as the hum of the city outside filtered through my windows, the sound of distant traffic mixing with the occasional wail of sirens, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw Melissa's smiling face hovering above a simmering pot, her hand tilting a small bottle, white grains raining down like snow into Daniel's dinner. And the thought made me want to scream. But I forced myself to stay calm, because Detective Harris had warned us that patience would be our weapon, that rushing could ruin everything. And so I spent the next morning moving through the house as though nothing had changed, sipping coffee at the kitchen island while Melissa hummed and diced vegetables, watching her with new eyes, noticing every twitch of her hands, every glance at me when she thought I wasn't looking. And when Daniel came down in his crisp suit, she leaned over to kiss him on the cheek with a tenderness that once would have warmed me, but now felt like venom disguised as affection. And I nearly choked on my coffee, forcing myself to smile and play along, but the act burned me inside. And when she handed him his lunch container, sliding it into his briefcase like any devoted wife, I imagined the toxic crystals lurking inside, invisible yet lethal, and had to excuse myself to the bathroom just to breathe, gripping the sink until my knuckles whitened, whispering to myself that the cameras Harris's team had installed overnight would catch everything, that soon we would have proof strong enough to shatter the mask Melissa wore so well. And that afternoon, as I sat with Daniel in the small surveillance room Harris had set up a few blocks from the precinct, watching the live feed from our own kitchen, my stomach knotted as Melissa appeared on screen, her hair pulled back, apron tied neatly, moving with practiced grace as she stirred a pot of soup. And then I saw it. The moment she reached into a cupboard, pulled out a small glass vial, unscrewed the cap, and with careful precision shook a dusting of white powder into the pot before quickly stirring, her expression cool, detached, as though she were adding nothing more dangerous than salt. And my nails dug into the wooden armrest of my chair so hard they nearly broke, tears stinging my eyes as rage coursed through me. Because there it was, the proof of betrayal I had both dreaded and needed, caught in high definition, undeniable. And though every cell in my body screamed to run home, to tear the spoon from her hand and demand answers, Harris placed a steady hand on my shoulder, his voice low and firm as he reminded me that justice required patience, that if we struck too soon, she could claim it was an innocent mistake, seasoning gone wrong, anything but deliberate poisoning. And I nodded, swallowing my fury, but the image of Melissa calmly poisoning the man she called her husband seared into my memory forever. And that night at dinner, when she placed the steaming bowl of soup in front of Daniel, cooing that she had made it just for him, I clenched my fists under the table, watching Daniel play his part, lifting the spoon to his lips with trembling hands before setting it down, groaning softly and pressing a hand to his stomach as if already weakened, and Melissa rushed to his side, her face arranged in the perfect mask of concern. But I caught it. That flicker in her eyes, the tiniest glimmer of satisfaction, like a predator watching its prey stumble, and I nearly exposed everything right then, my fury boiling over. But I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood, because Harris's plan was working. Melissa was unraveling, and the next day the lab confirmed what I already knew. The soup was laced with arsenic at twice the concentration of the first container, proof that she was
escalating, desperate, afraid of losing whatever twisted prize she thought was slipping through her fingers. And Harris told us quietly in his office that the next step was to tighten the noose, to push her buttons until she panicked. And that's when I remembered the will, the clause that made her sole heir if Daniel died, and I knew we had found the lever to pry her mask off. So I arranged for Charles, my attorney, to visit the house, making sure Melissa overheard me telling him I planned to change the will, donating the bulk of my estate to a children's charity. And I saw it. The way her hand froze mid-motion, the way her smile faltered before quickly recovering, but her eyes betrayed her, wide and dark with shock. And later that night, as she pretended to read on the couch, I overheard her whispering frantically on the phone in the backyard, her voice sharp and urgent, saying she couldn't wait any longer, that she had to act before it was too late, and my blood ran cold because now it wasn't just theory, she was plotting. And as I stood hidden in the dark hallway, recording her words on my phone, I felt the last threads of doubt snap inside me, and I knew that the woman I once called daughter had declared war on us. A war for money, for control, for everything Daniel and I held dear. And as I returned to my room, my hands shaking, I pressed the recording to Harris, whispering that it was almost over, that Melissa had trapped herself with her own greed. But even as I lay down that night, exhaustion pulling at me, I couldn't close my eyes without seeing her face, that mask of sweetness hiding a soul dark enough to kill. And I vowed silently to the God who had carried me through widowhood and motherhood that I would not let her succeed, that I would walk through fire if I had to, because nothing in this world meant more to me than protecting my son. And if Melissa wanted war, then she had chosen the wrong mother to underestimate.
The following days at home became a theater of lies, where every word, every gesture felt like a scene in a play I had never auditioned for. And though Daniel and I tried to carry on as though nothing was wrong, as though Melissa was still the loving wife and daughter-in-law we had once believed her to be, the truth sat between us like a loaded gun. And the tension was so thick, I could almost see it shimmering in the air. Because each time Melissa poured juice into Daniel's glass, I felt my throat close. Each time she set a plate in front of him, I watched like a hawk, waiting for her to slip. And more than once, I had to bite the inside of my cheek to stop myself from screaming across the table. Yet the charade continued because Detective Harris insisted we needed more, that Melissa would only be cornered when she confessed or made an irreversible move. So we baited her with talk of the will, with Daniel groaning more dramatically after meals, clutching his stomach as if he were weaker by the day, and Melissa seemed almost giddy at times, her eyes flashing when she thought no one noticed. A satisfaction so faint but so real it turned my blood to ice. And the night came when Daniel pushed away his half-eaten soup, letting his head lull as though he were too sick to go on, and Melissa was at his side in an instant, stroking his hair, whispering with mock concern that he was working too hard, that he needed rest. But I sawed it, that tiny curl of her lips before she masked it with a frown. And later, when she thought we were asleep, I heard her footsteps pacing in her bedroom, the murmur of her voice through the wall, words too muffled to make out but heavy with urgency. And my pulse thundered because I knew she was losing patience, ready to act before the inheritance slipped from her hands. And that's when Harris proposed the most dangerous part of the plan, one that chilled me to my marrow, even as I agreed. Because to break her, we would need Daniel to fake his own death, to let her believe she had succeeded, and only then, when she dropped her guard, would her mask shatter completely. So the preparations began in secret. Northwestern Memorial Hospital setting up a private room wired with cameras, doctors ready with makeup and monitors to simulate a cardiac arrest, while I rehearsed my part, the grieving mother, and Daniel rehearsed his, the poisoned husband collapsing at the dinner table. And the weight of it nearly broke me, because though I knew it was an act, the sight of my son lying pale and still, even in rehearsal, made my soul ache.
Yet I steeled myself because the end was near, and the night of the performance came cloaked in tension so heavy I thought I would suffocate. Melissa serving a bowl of soup with exaggerated tenderness, urging Daniel to eat, her voice honeyed but her eyes sharp, and Daniel lifted the spoon, pretending to take a bite before letting it clatter back into the bowl, groaning, clutching his stomach, staggering dramatically before collapsing across the table. And my scream ripped through the house so raw and sharp I almost believed it myself. Melissa rushing to his side, her hands fluttering over him, her face contorted into a mask of panic. But behind her tears, I glimpsed it again. That flicker, that unholy satisfaction, and I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911 with a voice that trembled with desperation, calling for an ambulance. And within minutes, uniformed paramedics, officers in disguise, stormed in, lifting Daniel onto a stretcher as Melissa sobbed beside me, insisting she had to ride along, that she was his wife. And I put a hand on her arm, my voice breaking as I said I would go, that she needed to stay behind. And though she fought, though her nails dug into my sleeve, finally she relented, and I climbed into the ambulance beside Daniel, gripping his hand as his eyes flickered open just long enough for him to whisper that he trusted me, that this had to work. And then he went still again, playing his part. And when we reached the hospital, they wheeled him into the prepared room, hooked him up to machines that beeped a flat line, and draped his body with a sheet. And I sat beside him with tears streaming down my cheeks, not all of them acting, because even though I knew he breathed, the sight of my son laid out as though he were gone tore through me like glass. But I pressed send on the message to Melissa. Daniel didn't make it. Come to the hospital now. And then I waited, heart hammering, while behind the mirrored glass, Detective Harris and his team crouched with cameras rolling. And 40 agonizing minutes later, the sound of her heels echoed down the hallway, Melissa bursting into the room, mascara smudged, hair in disarray, sobbing as she flung herself into my arms, crying that Daniel was too young, that life was cruel. But her words rang hollow in my ears. And when I guided her toward the bed, toward Daniel's still form, I watched her face transform, the tears falling, but her eyes brightening with something else, something wicked. And as she leaned over his body, thinking no one else could hear, she whispered, "Finally, it's over." And those words sliced through me like knives. But before I could react, Daniel's eyes shot open and he sat up, pulling the sheet away, his face pale but his eyes burning with fury as he stared at her and said in a voice colder than I had ever heard from my child, "Over? You mean after poisoning me piece by piece, after trying to kill me?" And Melissa staggered back, her scream tearing from her throat, her hand flying to her mouth as if she were staring at a ghost, crying that it couldn't be, that he was dead. And Detective Harris stepped into the room, flanked by officers, his badge gleaming as he said, "Melissa Parker, you're under arrest for attempted murder." And the moment hung frozen, Melissa's face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing, denying, babbling that it was only seasoning, that it was vitamins. But Harris silenced her with the press of a USB drive into her hand, telling her they had the footage, the recordings, the lab results, and her whispered confession at Daniel's bedside. And she collapsed then, her knees buckling as she sobbed, not with sorrow, but with rage, screaming that it wasn't fair, that if I hadn't changed the will, she wouldn't have had to hurry. And the truth spilled out of her like acid, her greed finally unmasked. And as the officers cuffed her and led her away, I clutched Daniel's hand, feeling the life in him, the warmth, the love. And though my heart was shattered by betrayal, it was steadied by the knowledge that we had survived, that we had turned her poison into her undoing. And I whispered in his ear, as tears blurred my vision, "You're safe now, son. She'll never touch you again." But deep down, I knew the scars she left would never fully heal, because betrayal like that doesn't just fade, it brands itself into your soul forever.
After Melissa's arrest, the quiet in our home was deafening, the kind of silence that doesn't soothe but suffocates. And though Daniel was alive, breathing, moving, I could see the shadows in his eyes, the way his hands trembled when he reached for a glass of water, the way he would startle at sudden noises. Because betrayal doesn't just poison the body, it poisons the soul. And the woman he had once trusted more than anyone had left scars deeper than the arsenic ever could. But even as he struggled with disbelief, I knew there was no room for pause because the legal storm had only just begun. And the morning after she was taken from the hospital in handcuffs, I walked with Daniel into the Cook County Courthouse where Detective Harris met us, his expression grim but resolute. And he explained that Melissa was already spinning lies, telling her public defender she had never touched poisoned, that she was framed, that the quote, powder was nothing but seasoning. And though we had hours of footage and recordings, Harris reminded us that trials are not about truth alone, but about convincing a jury, which meant we would have to relive every wound, every suspicion in front of strangers. And as I sat in the hard wooden bench, clutching Daniel's hand, I felt a surge of both dread and determination because I would not let Melissa twist this. I would not let her gaslight the world the way she had gaslit us. So when the prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Angela Brooks, laid out the case, she leaned heavily on our cooperation, emphasizing the chain of evidence we had preserved, from the first container I had accidentally carried to work, to the lab results, to the recordings of Melissa's late-night phone calls. And as she spoke, I could almost feel the walls of the courtroom trembling with the weight of truth. Yet when Melissa was let in wearing a wrinkled jumpsuit, her hair still somehow framing her face with that familiar softness, Daniel stiffened beside me, his breath catching. Because love, even when it curdles into betrayal, leaves behind an ache that logic cannot erase. And I squeezed his hand hard, grounding him, whispering that we had to be strong. And then it began. Witness after witness called. Richard testifying about the white granules I had shown him in the office, his voice cracking as he said he had seen too many bodies destroyed by toxins to doubt what he saw. The young doctor from Northwestern, explaining in clinical but devastating detail how Daniel's symptoms matched arsenic poisoning. The detective presenting the footage of Melissa tilting that glass vial into the soup, and the recording of her whisper at Daniel's bedside, "Finally, it's over," played in the hushed courtroom, the words echoing like a funeral bell. And I felt every gaze turned toward her. But Melissa didn't crumble. She raised her chin, her tears flowing as she insisted it was taken out of context, that she was grieving and meant something else. And for a moment, I saw jurors shift uncomfortably because Melissa had always been charming, always had that way of softening her tone to make people lean closer, believe her. And my stomach twisted with fear that even now, even here, she could spin her web. But then the prosecutor pulled out the final piece, my will, the clause that made Melissa sole heir if Daniel died. And suddenly the jury's faces hardened, the puzzle snapping together, and Melissa's sobs turned into shrieks, her voice cracking as she shouted that it wasn't fair, that she had grown up with nothing, that marrying into our family was supposed to change everything, and now that I was giving my fortune to charity brats, she had no choice. And the silence that followed was like a thunderclap, because in her rage, she had confessed before us all, and Daniel buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking, while I sat frozen, torn between relief that her mask had finally slipped, and sorrow that the woman I had once called daughter had revealed herself to be nothing more than greed wrapped in skin. And when the gavel finally came down, when the judge declared her remanded without bail, I felt a weight lift. And yet another fall, because justice is not the same as healing. And as we left the courthouse that day, the cameras from local news stations flashed in our faces, reporters shouting questions, headlines already swirling. Chicago financier's wife arrested in arsenic plot. And though I wanted to shield Daniel from the glare, there was no hiding anymore. Our private nightmare had become public spectacle. And in the days that followed, we faced the fallout.
Whispers at the office, investors uneasy about Daniel's reputation, neighbors watching our house with morbid curiosity. And still, in the quiet of our home, I could hear Daniel whisper at night that he didn't understand how the woman he had loved could smile at him while slipping poison into his plate. And all I could do was hold him, stroke his hair as I had when he was a boy, and tell him that survival sometimes comes at the price of illusions, that the mask Melissa wore had fooled us both, but masks can never last forever. And even though the world seemed determined to feast on our tragedy, I reminded him that we still had something Melissa never could. The bond between mother and son, forged in sacrifice and tested in fire, unbreakable even by betrayal. And in that truth, however painful, I found the strength to keep going, to prepare for the battles ahead, because the war was not over, but we had already won the most important fight. We had kept Daniel alive. The weeks after the courthouse hearing were some of the strangest of my life, because on the surface, everything seemed calmer. Melissa locked away in Cook County Jail awaiting trial, Daniel slowly regaining strength as the arsenic traces in his system diminished under careful treatment, and me, back at the fragrance company I had built from nothing, standing in the laboratory surrounded by glass vials and polished chrome counters, inhaling notes of lavender and amber that once brought me joy. But beneath that calm was a turbulence I could not shake, a gnawing awareness that Melissa's shadow lingered even in her absence, because betrayal leaves ghosts that haunt every corner of your life, and I felt it each time I stepped into my kitchen, remembering how casually she had stirred death into Daniel's soup. I felt it at every family dinner when the empty seat across the table screamed louder than words. I felt it in the way Daniel stared at his plate before eating, cautious even when I was the one who had cooked. And though Detective Harris reassured us that the case against Melissa was airtight, that she would likely face decades behind bars, I knew her reach hadn't ended, because greed doesn't vanish when the bars close. It festers and spreads like mold. And sure enough, one evening as Daniel and I sat on the balcony of our Lakeshore Drive condo, watching the lake shimmer under the fading sunset, his phone buzzed with an unknown number. And when he answered, a voice hissed through the line, cold and sharp, saying that Melissa wasn't done, that she had friends, that we hadn't won yet. And Daniel's face drained of color, his hand trembling as he shoved the phone toward me, but the line had already gone dead, leaving only the echo of that threat buzzing in my ears. And though Harris later told us not to panic, that anonymous threats were common in high-profile cases, I knew deep down it wasn't just noise, that Melissa had woven her web deeper than we realized, and my fears were confirmed days later when Angela Brooks, the prosecutor, called me into her office, her lips pressed into a hard line as she slid a stack of papers across the desk, revealing that Melissa had petitioned for access to Daniel's financial accounts, claiming as his legal wife, she had rights even from jail. And though the petition was denied, the audacity of it made my stomach churn, because it wasn't just about the money, it was about power, about reminding us that she was still tethered to our lives, tugging at us from behind the walls of her cell. And Daniel, already fragile, spiraled under the weight of it, his once sharp shoulders hunched, his nights restless, muttering in his sleep as if reliving the taste of poisoned soup, the sting of betrayal. And one night I found him standing by the window, his reflection pale in the glass, whispering that maybe Melissa was right. Maybe he wasn't strong enough to keep living with the world knowing he had been fooled so badly. And my heart broke hearing those words from the son I had always seen as unshakable. And I held him like I hadn't since he was a boy, my arms tight around him as I told him that survival is not shame, that strength is not in never falling but in getting up after being dragged through hell. And I promised him that together we would not just survive Melissa's treachery, we would transform it into something she could never steal, our dignity, our legacy, our ability to rise. And that very next morning, I acted on that promise, standing in front of my board of directors, announcing that the charitable foundation I had once spoken of in jest, the one that had driven Melissa into panic, would become reality. That we would funnel millions into a trust for women escaping abusive homes, for families broken by betrayal. Because if Melissa had taught me anything, it was that greed destroys, but giving restores. And though some shareholders grumbled, the majority stood and applauded. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of control return to my chest, a fire that no poison could extinguish. Yet, even as hope flickered back into our lives, I couldn't ignore the tightening noose of the trial ahead. The way Melissa's lawyers filed motions, challenged evidence, tried to paint Daniel as an unstable husband making false claims to ruin her. And I sat through deposition after deposition, my pulse hammering as they attempted to twist my words, asking why I had trusted Melissa so deeply if she was so dangerous, asking if maybe I had confused sugar for poison, if maybe grief had blurred my judgment. And though my voice shook, I told the truth, every detail, because I would not let them erase what I had seen, what I had lived. And when I left the courthouse one afternoon, reporters swarming with microphones shoved in my face, I ignored their questions about whether I hated Melissa, because the truth was more complicated. I didn't hate her. Hate would have been easier. I pitied her, pitied the emptiness inside her that had twisted love into greed. But pity did not mean forgiveness. And as Daniel and I walked through that gauntlet of flashing cameras, his hand in mine, I whispered to him that no matter how many times she tried to claw her way back into our lives, she would never win, because she had already lost the one thing money could never buy, the family she betrayed. And the further we went into that fight, the more I understood that Melissa's poison was never just in the food. It was in her hunger for more, in her inability to see the wealth she already had. And that realization hardened me, steeled me. Because if the past months had been war, then we were no longer victims hiding behind walls. We were survivors carrying torches, ready to burn down every shadow she had cast over us.
The day of the trial arrived like a storm cloud that had been hanging over us for months, heavy and inevitable. And as Daniel and I walked up the stone steps of the Cook County Courthouse, the air felt electric. Reporters clustered behind barricades, shouting our names, cameras flashing, the words arsenic plot plastered across every newsstand. And though Daniel's suit was pressed and his hair neatly combed, I could see the strain in his face, the sleepless nights carved into lines around his eyes, and my own chest felt tight with the weight of what we were about to endure, because no matter how strong the evidence, no matter how clear Melissa's greed had been, the courtroom was another battlefield, one where her charm could twist, where her lawyers could manipulate. And as we entered, there she was, seated at the defense table in a tailored navy dress, her hair pulled back in a polished bun, looking more like a corporate executive than a woman accused of slowly killing her husband. And when her eyes met Daniel's, she smiled faintly, a smile so familiar it made my stomach lurch. And I realized then that Melissa had no intention of admitting guilt, that she would fight to her last breath to keep her mask intact. And so the trial began. Witness after witness called, the prosecution laying out the narrative we had lived. Richard describing in detail the moment I showed him the container at work, his voice breaking as he told the jury he had recognized the granules instantly as a toxin. The lab technicians presenting charts and graphs showing lethal concentrations of arsenic in the soup and juice samples. Detective Harris narrating the surveillance footage where Melissa's own hand tilted the vial into Daniel's meals. And then came the recording, her whisper at his bedside, "Finally, it's over," playing in the hushed courtroom like a dagger slicing through air. And the jurors leaned forward, their faces taut with unease, and for a moment I thought the case was sealed. But then the defense rose, and Melissa's attorney, a slick man in a gray suit with a voice like honey, began painting a different picture, claiming the grains were seasoning, that the footage was misleading, that Melissa's whisper was taken out of context, that Daniel's symptoms could have come from stress, ulcers, even contaminated takeout food. And as he spoke, Melissa dabbed her eyes with a tissue, nodding sadly, playing the role of the misunderstood wife. And I felt the room shift, jurors glancing at her with hesitation. And fear clawed at me, because I knew how easily she could weave her spell. But then it was our turn. Daniel taking the stand,
his voice trembling at first as he described months of fatigue, stomach pain, and confusion, how he had trusted every meal she prepared, how he had dismissed the signs until it nearly killed him. And as he spoke, his voice grew stronger, firmer, and I saw the jurors' faces harden again, the sympathy draining as they looked at Melissa with suspicion. And then I was called. My hands sweating as I swore to tell the truth, my throat tight as I recounted the day of the mix-up, how I had carried that container to work by accident, how Richard's face had gone pale, how the doctor's words, arsenic, had shattered my world. And I told them about the will, about the clause that would have made Melissa the sole heir if Daniel died, about the moment she overheard me planning to donate the estate to charity, and how her panic had spilled into late-night phone calls I had recorded. And though the defense tried to rattle me, suggesting I had motives to frame Melissa, that I resented her closeness with Daniel, I met their questions head-on, my voice breaking only when I looked directly at her and said, I loved her like a daughter. I trusted her with my son's life, and she tried to take him from me. And in that silence, I knew the jury felt the weight of my words. Because betrayal is universal. It pierces deeper than knives. And when the closing arguments came, the prosecutor's voice rang clear, reminding them that this was not about misunderstandings or seasoning. It was about greed. About a woman who saw her husband not as a partner, but as an obstacle to a fortune. And Melissa's attorney tried his best, spinning tales of love, claiming the state had built a case on coincidence. But when the jury left to deliberate, Daniel gripped my hand so tight my fingers ached. And hours crawled like days, until finally the foreman returned, unfolding the slip of paper that would decide everything. And in the silence so heavy I could hear my own heartbeat, the words were read. Guilty on all counts. And the air left my lungs in a rush, Daniel collapsing against me as tears streaked down his face, my arms wrapping around him as though he were still my boy. And across the room, Melissa shrieked, her mask cracking at last, shouting that it wasn't fair, that she deserved the money, that we had ruined her life, but the bailiffs pulled her away, her cries echoing down the corridor as the judge pronounced her sentence, 25 years without parole. And though justice had been served, the victory was bittersweet, because no sentence could erase the nights Daniel lay awake, haunted by the taste of poison. No gavel strike could mend the hole in my heart where trust had once lived. Yet as we walked out of that courthouse into the crisp Chicago air, reporters clamoring around us, I felt a strange peace settle over me, not because the war was over, but because we had survived it. Because Melissa's greed had been exposed to the world, and because Daniel, my son, still stood at my side, alive, breathing, and though scarred, stronger than I had ever known him to be.
In the weeks after the verdict, life began to stitch itself back together in fragile, uneven threads, as though Daniel and I were piecing a quilt out of scraps of fabric torn by fire. And though Melissa was behind bars, her name a stain whispered in hushed tones across Chicago, the scars she left lingered in every corner of our home, because healing is never instant. It creeps in slowly, awkwardly, like the first shoots of green pushing through frozen ground. And I saw it in the way Daniel approached each meal with caution, sniffing his food before eating, forcing a smile when I reminded him I had cooked it myself. And I felt it in my own chest every night when I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying her whisper in that hospital room. Finally, it's over. And wondering how long she had rehearsed those words. How many nights she had stirred poison into dinner while humming like nothing was wrong. But amidst that darkness, there were sparks of light, too, because Daniel began going back to his office, his colleagues embracing him with warmth instead of pity, the board of directors standing behind him as he steered the firm with renewed clarity. And I poured myself into the foundation I had promised to build, christening it the Haven Trust, a name that would carry our pain into purpose,
dedicating millions towards shelters for women and children escaping the kind of betrayal that doesn't always leave bruises, but can shatter a soul. And the day we cut the ribbon on our first center in Bronzeville, Daniel stood beside me, his hand steady in mine, his smile soft but genuine for the first time in months. And as the cameras flashed and reporters asked about Melissa, I told them the truth, that greed can hollow a person until they see family not as love, but as leverage. But love, true love, is stronger than poison, stronger than betrayal, because it survives even when trust is broken. And I meant every word, because I had lived it. And that night, as we returned home, the city skyline glowing against the lake, Daniel and I sat on the balcony in silence, the cool wind tugging at our hair, and he whispered, "Mom, I don't know if I'll ever understand why she did it." And I pulled him into my arms, my heart aching and swelling all at once, telling him he didn't need to understand, that some hearts are so consumed by greed they will never know peace, but that we were still here, still together, and that was all that mattered. And his shoulders shook as he cried quietly, letting go of months of torment. And I cried too, not just for the pain we had endured, but for the relief of still having him alive beside me. Because in the end, Melissa had failed. Not because the law had caged her, but because her poison hadn't taken what she wanted most. Because Daniel lived. Because our bond endured. And as I looked out over the city lights twinkling against the black water, I thought of all the mothers still fighting silent battles, of all the sons and daughters who trusted the wrong people, and I whispered into the night a prayer for them, that they might find their voices, their strength, before it's too late. And in that moment, I felt a strange peace wash over me. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of resilience. A reminder that though Melissa had tried to write our ending with arsenic, she had underestimated the power of a mother's love, because love is the one thing that can never be poisoned. And I vowed then and there that our story would not be remembered as one of tragedy, but one of survival, of justice, of legacy. And when Daniel squeezed my hand and said, "We're going to be okay, Mom," I finally believed him, because the worst was behind us. The future was ours to reclaim, and no amount of greed, betrayal, or poison could ever take that away.